Morning, friends. I would like to thank you for letting me come speak to you today as a part of the conference. My name is Reverend Justin Hancock. My wife and I run a disability theology and empowerment organization known as the Julian Way. I am an ordained United Methodist pastor living in Dallas, Texas, and I love talking about theology and disability and the gifts and graces therein and how disability relates to the way that we talk about God and we talk about our own calling. And that's a little bit of what I want to do today by using the models of disability or the ways we talk about disability to reflect on what the gospel says about disability. I come out of the Christian tradition, so my reflection partner in this will be Jesus, and we'll try to relate each of the models of disability that we talk about, the medical model, the social model, the limits model, and then finally our preferred model, the cultural model of disability. Each time we talk about a model, I'll give you a definition of the model and then I'll try to reflect what I think Christ or Jesus would say about that model and how that might reflect on the gospel teachings of Jesus Christ. Excuse me, and it's important to realize that as we talk about the models of disability, I'm not trying to propose specific solutions or tell you how to think about disability or what to think, although I have my opinions and my likes and dislikes of each model. But I'm really trying to give you theological tools to play with and then equip you to help make your own decisions as you write sermons or teach Sunday school or interact with your faith in whatever way you choose. Think of it like building blocks. I have a 2-year-old son that loves to build with blocks. So I'm really trying to give you a way to talk about these larger concepts. So the model that we're going to start with is the medical model of disability. And this is the model that probably if you ask, I guess, 100 people on the street, I would gather that at least 80 of them are going to give you some sort of medical definition of disability. In the medical model of disability, disability is a medical situation or problem or abnormality per se, and there are a range of therapeutic or medical options to solve the problem. Within disability theology and disability activism, this is kind of the model that everybody loves to hate because it's the model that persons with disabilities have been dealing with for so long. This model is in the background of things like the 1911 Chicago Ugly Laws and years of forced institutionalization of persons with disabilities. So, what would the gospel say about this model? What would Jesus say? Well, first of all, we have to say not much, because Christ would not meet the standards of, we have no way of knowing or no way of perceiving that Christ would meet the standards of somebody who is disabled, or the way that the medical model would frame disability, at least. And in fact, some pastors who don't see or have taught that disability is a lack or caused by sin or not part of God's plan, even maybe unintentionally using a medical framework when they talk about disability. So even the medical model has gotten into more traditional teachings around disability in the Christian church in that way. So we move on from there as a response to the medical model to the social model of disability. And the social model was constructed or developed in the mid 1970s, first in the United Kingdom and then in the United States by disability theorists and activists who were responding to the medical model. And what they said is that people have impairments. These are the conditions of disability, like my cerebral palsy is my impairment. But a person only becomes disabled when they meet barriers within the built physical or cultural or social environment, like lack of curb cuts, lack of elevators in buildings, lack of wider doorways, or even attitudinal barriers or societal barriers in the way we think about disability. Only when a person's impairment come up against those things do those things move from being bodily impairments or neurological impairments to disabilities. And actually, when we take a look at what the gospel says in this framework, the social model has been key to the development of disability theology because we begin to read Jesus as healing folks, not so much for their physicality or the sake of the physicality of the disability, but for the restoration back into community of that day. And the restoring power of Jesus has much more to do with the refusing or reintroduction of an individual back into community. So that is why the social model has been so key and is still very key to the development of disability theology. I am concerned, however, that one of the ways that Jesus is often read or could be read if somebody wanted to use the social model to critique Jesus is that Jesus is seeking to erase disability by removing someone's impairment and removing someone's physical marks of disability. And I think the important thing to note there is that the social model technically does not want to remove the distinctive parts of disability, but I do think it can stray into the erasure of disability, which I think is an important part of who someone is, by wanting to remove the physical barriers, the social model. And I think the social model, if used to critique Jesus, would say that by removing someone's impairment, Jesus is choosing to erase people with disability from our cultural and social maps. So I think the social model does a good job societally about helping us address that disability is not necessarily a lack or deficit that has to do with someone's impairments, but has much more to do with the social environment. And I think the social model could critique Jesus if it wanted to for Jesus' removal of impairments and wanting to remove people with disabilities from the social cultural map. I hope that makes sense. I think a shortcoming of the social model is that it doesn't often take into account the physicality of disability and the sort of soul forming portion of disability, is what I would say. What I mean by that is, or if not soul, the identity forming part of disability, which I would describe as someone's soul. What I mean by that is I carry my disability around with me everywhere I go every day. I'm very proud of being a person with cerebral palsy. It's a distinctive part of me that I like very much. And the social model, by only paying attention to societal barriers, tends to remove the human aspect and the identity forming or the soul forming aspect of disability. And moving on from the social model, we begin to see this get addressed in the early 2000s by a theologian and woman named Deborah Beth Creamer, who taught and is still located, I believe, at Iliff School of Theology, even though I think she retired a few years back. And she developed the limits model of disability. And what the limits model says is that disability is that every embodiment, whether it be classically considered able-bodied or disabled, every embodiment, every human embodiment, deals with being limited. That humans are very limited creatures, that's just sort of natural in who we are, and it's what we do with those limits and how we use perseverance, strength, and creativity that can move us towards God and a better understanding of ourselves and God if we understand that we are inherently limited creatures. And what this does is it gives people with disabilities the opportunity to understand that I feel more disabled on days that my hips aren't doing well because my arthritis flares up, or days when I'm feeling more spastic because of my natural spasticity. On those days, I am more disabled than on days when I am feeling better or physically more grounded in an okay spot with my embodiment. I am less disabled. So it starts to address both the physical and social aspects of disability. It doesn't discount the presence of social barriers, but it does take into account both, or it attempts to take into account both the social and physical limitations of human embodiment. But if we talk about Jesus, I think this model has some positive aspects and some negative aspects. I think talking about perseverance, creativity, and strength, we can see aspects of that in Jesus' ministry. We can see the way that he creatively interacted with folks, even in healing miracles, putting mud in folks' eye to open their eyes and to restore them to community. Even the feeding of the 5,000 was a trust and a creativity in his relationship with God. And we see Jesus persevering from a point of great suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane when he was praying to God, please take this cup from me. So we see aspects of even the human limits that Jesus had to creatively, navigate in his ministry. I think one of the areas where the limits model falls short when we talk about disability is it can lead to passing, or it can lead to uh, some folks being able to navigate their disability because their impairment does not affect them as much, so they can pass as non-disabled and navigate the world a little bit easier, and other folks maybe not. So it really doesn't leave a lot of room for a balanced perspective of disability unless you can pass, or unless you can navigate the world because you're quote unquote less impaired than others. And when we talk about theologically, no one, I think there is a vast room for exploration using the limits model if we talk about the fact that the very God, creator of the universe, limited himself and took on flesh. If we use the limits model of disability to talk about Christ in that way, specifically with his post-resurrection appearances when the wounds were still in his body, and the choice that was to be a self-limiting God, I think there's some vast possibilities for good work to be done there, but nobody has done that yet because as much as the limits model is connected to theology directly, nobody has chosen to do that work. So maybe if you're listening to this presentation and you're of a theological bent, go and do that work with my blessing. So our final model of disability that we're going to talk about today is my favorite. It's the cultural model of disability. And excuse me while I get a drink of water real quick. This is something we have to deal with occasionally when we're teaching, is the need to pause real quick. Just gonna stay with me. Thank you, pardon me. So when we talk about the cultural model of disability, the cultural model of disability says that every culture in its art, its language, its way of doing things, its way of organizing, its politics, every cultural aspect has a framework of normal and a framework of abnormal, or expected and unexpected. And everything that is normal is quote unquote able-bodied, and every embodiment that's expected is able-bodied, and every embodiment that's unexpected or abnormal is disabled. And what this allows us to do on the disability activism side is take a 30,000-foot view of disability and kind of remove the hierarchy of disability and say, if you view your own story, or if there is something that rings to you as a disability within your own story, you are invited to the table, and you are invited to contribute to this conversation and be a part. So what it does is it tries to remove the hierarchy. It says that I can't dictate to you what your experience of disability is, and you can't dictate to me, but maybe if we come together and we talk about our own experiences, and we talk about being unexpected or outside of the norm of what the culture expects, we can find common ground and we can really expand the definition and empower one another to understand ourselves, and in the theological context, understand what God is calling us to do as disabled people. So it really is a big tent solution or big tent strategy for engaging disability, which is why I like it so much and why the Julian way tends to operate in the cultural model so much. And so, what does the cultural model tell us about the way that Jesus would interact with disability? Well, something very significant, because the cultural model has a lot to do with how is disability perceived in the day and time that we are in. How does the broader culture right now perceive disability? And if we take that to Jesus, one of my favorite stories for approaching this in this way is the woman with the issue of blood, or the hemorrhaging woman story. In that story, in the Gospel of Mark, we see that Jesus is touched by a woman who is hemorrhaging, had been hemorrhaging for 12 years, and a woman touches the fringe of Jesus' garment and is immediately healed. And what does Jesus say? Power has gone out from me. Who touched me? And New Testament scholar Canada Moss really brought this to light for my wife and I at the Julian way. When she says that the way that the woman's hemorrhaging body is talked about and the way that the power going out of Jesus is talked about, those are very similar words. So the woman had a body that struggled with boundaries, or a very porous body, and Jesus had a very porous body. He could not control his own body, or he could not control how his power flowed from his own body. So in a way, we can see that in the common parlance of Jesus' day, because his body was unbounded and sort of fragile, he would be considered disabled as well, just as the woman would have been, because her body is unbounded and fragile. And this gives us a way to engage with disability that makes Jesus much more aware, or have a much bigger stake in the game of disability and bodily impairment if we view disability in Jesus in this way. And then we can go on into the Gospel of John and see that Jesus had the wounds of, had disabling wounds even in the post-resurrection appearances. And you're not going to tell me you're going to walk the same way and move the same way if you've got holes in your wrist or your hands and you've got holes in your feet. Those are going to show up. Those are going to show up in your gait and in the way you hold things and in the way you experience your world. So we know, using a cultural model framework, that Jesus has intimate experience with disability, even in the most fundamental parts of his ministry, and that erasure of disability or physical impairment maybe would not have been something that Jesus was so comfortable with, or that we can't, what I mean is we can't assume that Jesus would have just been about erasing or getting rid of physical impairment because it's a blemish or a lack, because we can see that throughout his ministry, it came back even into his own body. So I hope that the ways that we've talked about the models of disability can be very helpful to you in the way you do ministry and the way you engage with folks with disabilities. If you have a disabling experience of your own, I hope it gives you a new method or way to view your own experience. I think every model of disability even has something that you can take from it. Maybe not the medical model, wink wink, but that may just be my own opinion. But I really do hope this conversation has been helpful to you and has given you much food for thought, and fruitful conversation. There we go. As you move forward and as you exercise your own faith in an embodied world and in a world with many different embodiments. And I just pray that we move forward with the spirit of openness and a spirit of receptivity for what God has for us for the rest of the conference. And as you move into your engagement with your own faith and your own ministry, God bless. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.